Thomas and Jean were not heroes. They were not soldiers, scientists, or explorers. They were maintenance workers, blue-collar cogs in the vast, intergalactic machine of human expansion. In a universe teeming with advanced civilizations, humanity had carved out its niche as the scrappy underdog, willing to do the dirty jobs no one else wanted. And there was no dirtier job than working for Stellar Dynamics Incorporated, a company infamous for its cutthroat contracts and questionable safety standards. Thomas was the older of the two, a grizzled veteran of the trade, with a face weathered by years of exposure to hostile atmospheres and radiation leaks. His left arm was cybernetic, a sleek but utilitarian replacement after an accident on a gas giant refinery. He had a dry sense of humor and a knack for fixing things that shouldn't even be fixable. If it was broken, Thomas could make it work again, sometimes better than before. Jean was younger, fresh out of her training rotation but already showing promise. She had a sharp mind and quicker hands, often surprising Thomas with her ability to improvise under pressure. Her optimism was almost irritating at times, but Thomas secretly admired it. She still believed in humanity's potential to thrive in this chaotic galaxy. Together, they made an unlikely but effective team. When the assignment came through for Vados-XLR8, neither of them was particularly thrilled. The planet was listed as a Category 4 energy harvester, which meant it was essentially a giant machine disguised as a celestial body. Its core generated immense amounts of power by harnessing gravitational forces from its 3 moons, feeding energy back into the interstellar grid that powered entire sectors of space. But like all machines, it needed upkeep, and that's where Thomas and Jean came in. The briefing was sparse, as always. A malfunction in the planetary core's stabilizers had caused irregular energy surges, threatening to destabilize the entire system. If left unchecked, Vados-XLR8 could collapse into itself, creating a black hole that would devour everything within light years. No pressure. Their transport shuttle, a battered relic affectionately nicknamed the Mule, dropped out of hyperspace above the planet's atmosphere. From orbit, Vados-XLR8 looked deceptively serene, swirling clouds of violet and gold wrapped around a surface that shimmered like polished metal. But Thomas knew better. Beneath that beautiful facade lay kilometers of machinery, humming with barely contained power. Why do I feel like this is going to be worse than they told us? Jean muttered as she strapped herself into her seat for atmospheric entry. Because it always is, Thomas replied without looking up from his console. Rule number 1. Never trust corporate briefings. The shuttle shuddered violently as it pierced the upper atmosphere, turbulence rattling every bolt and rivet. Jean gripped her harness tightly, her knuckles white against the fabric. Relax, Thomas said with a smirk. If this thing was going to fall apart, it would have done it years ago. That's not comforting, Jean shot back. The Mule finally broke through the turbulence, descending toward the planet's surface where their landing coordinates blinked on the HUD. The designated drop zone was near one of the stabilizer towers, a massive structure jutting out from the metallic crust like a jagged tooth. As they approached, Jean's eyes widened at the scale of it all. The tower stretched miles into the sky, its surface alive with shifting panels and glowing conduits. It looked less like something built by human hands and more like an alien monolith left behind by some ancient civilization. First time seeing one up close? Thomas asked. Jean nodded silently. Don't let it intimidate you, he said gruffly. It's just another machine that needs fixing. The Mule touched down with a hiss of hydraulics on a landing pad at the base of the tower. The air outside was breathable, but heavy with static electricity. Every hair on their bodies stood on end as they stepped out onto the platform in their reinforced suits. Thomas activated his wrist scanner and frowned at the readings. Great, he muttered. The stabilizer's main conduits are fried, and there's some kind of interference screwing with remote diagnostics. What kind of interference? Jean asked. The kind that makes our job harder, Thomas replied dryly. They gathered their tools and headed toward an access hatch at the base of the tower. As they worked to override the lock mechanism, Jean couldn't shake an uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. Do you hear that? She asked suddenly. Thomas paused and listened. At first, there was nothing but the faint hum of machinery. But then he heard it too, a low, rhythmic thrum echoing through the metal structure like a heartbeat. "That's not normal," he said grimly. The hatch finally opened with a groan, revealing a dimly lit maintenance corridor stretching deep into the tower's interior. The sound grew louder as they stepped inside, reverberating through their boots like distant thunder. "Stay close," Thomas warned as they moved forward cautiously. Jean nodded, gripping her plasma torch tightly as her eyes darted around nervously. The further they went, the more unsettling their surroundings became. Panels flickered erratically. Conduits sparked with bursts of energy. Strange symbols were etched into some surfaces as if someone, or something, had been here before them. "What are those markings?" Jean whispered. "No idea," Thomas admitted. "But I don't like them." As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with something neither of them had expected, an alien drone hovering silently in their path. The drone hung there in the air, motionless yet undeniably alive in its own mechanical way. It was sleek, angular, and utterly alien in design, its surface a dark, iridescent material that seemed to ripple faintly as if it were breathing. A single, glowing eye-like sensor fixed on them, unblinking. It made no sound, no movement. Just watched. Thomas and Jean froze in place, their instincts screaming at them to retreat, but neither dared to make the first move. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the tower's machinery and the distant pulse of that strange rhythmic thrum. "What the hell is it doing?" Jean whispered, her voice barely audible over their comms. "Nothing," Thomas replied tersely. "And that's what worries me." Jean tightened her grip on her plasma torch, her palms slick with sweat inside her gloves. "Should we?" "No," Thomas interrupted sharply. "We don't poke it. We don't provoke it. We just keep moving." Jean hesitated but nodded. Slowly, they edged around the drone, keeping as much distance as the narrow corridor would allow. The drone didn't follow them. It simply pivoted slightly to keep its unblinking gaze locked on them as they passed. It wasn't until they turned a corner and lost sight of it that Jean let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That was weird," she muttered. Thomas grunted in agreement, but said nothing. He didn't like this, not one bit. The briefing had mentioned nothing about alien tech or surveillance drones. If anything, Vados-XLR8 was supposed to be an entirely human-operated facility. The presence of that drone raised too many questions, none of which he had answers for. They continued deeper into the tower's labyrinthine interior, their footsteps echoing eerily in the empty corridors. The place felt wrong, not just malfunctioning but abandoned, neglected in a way that made Thomas's skin crawl. Panels hung loose from walls. Conduits dangled like severed veins, sparking feebly. Entire sections of the floor were coated in a fine layer of dust and debris. "This doesn't look like a place that just needs repairs," Jean said after a while, her voice tinged with unease. "It looks like no one's been here for years." "Yeah," Thomas agreed grimly. "And yet someone, or something, is still watching us." Jean shuddered at the thought, but tried to focus on the task at hand. They reached another junction where a flickering hollow map displayed a schematic of the stabilizer tower, or at least what was left of it. Large sections of the structure were marked as offline or inaccessible due to damage. "Great," Thomas muttered as he studied the map. "The main control hub is 3 levels down from here. Looks like we'll have to take one of the maintenance shafts." Jean groaned inwardly at the thought of crawling through cramped spaces filled with who knows what kind of hazards, but she knew better than to complain. This was their job, after all. As they worked their way toward the nearest access point for the maintenance shafts, Jean decided to break the tense silence with conversation, a habit she'd picked up during her training rotations when long hours in confined spaces could drive even seasoned workers stir-crazy. "You ever think about why they hate us so much?" she asked suddenly. Thomas glanced at her sideways. "Oh, the aliens," Jean clarified. "All those advanced species out there, the ones with telekinesis or wings or whatever other fancy abilities they have. They look at us like we're, I don't know, vermin." Thomas snorted derisively, but didn't immediately respond. He wasn't much for philosophical debates, especially not while crawling through what amounted to an intergalactic junkyard. I mean, Jean continued, undeterred by his silence. We don't have any special powers or advanced biology or anything like that. We're just human, and Thomas said finally, his tone gruff but not dismissive. And I guess I don't get why they hate us so much for it, Jean said with a shrug. It's not like we chose to be this way. Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression unreadable beneath his visor, but his voice carrying an edge of bitterness when he spoke. They hate us because we don't quit, he said simply. Because we don't have wings or telekinesis or whatever else they've got. And yet we're still here. Still building ships and colonies and energy harvesters on planets like this one. Jean frowned thoughtfully at his words as they resumed walking. They see us as pests, Thomas continued after a moment, his tone softening slightly. Because no matter how many times they knock us down, or how many ways they try to keep us out, we keep coming back. Jean nodded slowly, understanding dawning on her face. It's not about what we don't have, Thomas added quietly. It's about what we do have and what we're willing to do with it. The conversation lingered in Jean's mind as they reached the maintenance shaft and began their descent into its dimly lit depths. The further down they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, both physically and emotionally. The strange rhythmic thrum they'd heard earlier grew louder here, resonating through the walls like some kind of mechanical heartbeat. And yet there was still no sign of any active personnel, human or otherwise. This place is giving me serious ghost ship vibes, Jean muttered as she crawled through yet another narrow passageway littered with broken equipment and strange markings etched into every surface. You're not wrong, Thomas admitted grimly as he scanned their surroundings with his wrist scanner again, but once more found nothing useful beyond interference signals that made no sense. As they emerged into a larger chamber, filled with towering machinery humming faintly with residual power, and more of those unsettling alien symbols carved into its walls, they couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them again. The drone was still there, hovering silently in the shadows of the chamber. It hadn't moved an inch since they first saw it, but its presence was a constant weight pressing down on them. Its glowing eye tracked their every step, unblinking and unervingly patient, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Thomas and Jean exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Talking about it wouldn't change the fact that it was there, watching. They had seen drones before, plenty of them, in fact, but this one was different. It wasn't human-made, that much was certain. Its design was too alien, too sleek and organic in its movements. And the way it simply observed them without engaging, that wasn't standard behavior for any automated system they'd encountered. No warnings, no attempts at communication, just silent, unwavering observation. Thomas muttered under his breath as he turned his attention back to the task at hand. Let's just get this over with. Jean nodded, though her eyes kept darting back to the drone as they approached the massive generator core at the center of the chamber. The structure loomed over them like a mechanical colossus, its surface alive with faint pulses of light that flickered erratically, clear signs of instability. Conduits snaked out from its base like tangled roots, some sparking dangerously, while others lay lifeless and cold. This thing's a mess, Jean said as she scanned the generator with her handheld diagnostic tool. The readings were chaotic, power surges spiking and dropping unpredictably, systems failing faster than they could be logged. It's a miracle this hasn't already blown itself to pieces. Miracles don't pay our bills, Thomas grumbled as he opened his toolkit and began unpacking their equipment. Let's focus on fixing it before we start counting blessings. Jean crouched beside him and pulled out her own tools, her hands moving with practiced precision despite the tension in the air. They worked in silence for a while, each focused on their respective tasks, rerouting power flows, replacing fried components, patching up damaged conduits. But even as they worked, neither could shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by the drone, but by something larger, more malevolent. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. The kind of gut-deep certainty that came from years of experience in hostile environments where survival often depended on sensing danger before it struck. Jean finally broke the silence as she tightened a bolt on one of the replacement conduits. "You think they're watching us?" Thomas didn't look up from his work. "Of course they're watching us. I mean them," Jean clarified, gesturing subtly toward the drone without taking her eyes off her task. Thomas paused for a moment before answering. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think they are." Jean frowned but didn't press further. She didn't need to. They both knew what this meant. If aliens were monitoring their progress and doing nothing to stop them, it could only mean one thing. They wanted the generator repaired before making their move. "They're waiting," Jean said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "For us to finish," Jean replied grimly. Thomas exhaled sharply through his nose and nodded. "Figures." They worked faster after that, their movements efficient and precise despite the growing tension between them. Every spark from their tools felt like a beacon signaling their presence. Every flicker of light from the generator felt like an ominous countdown, ticking closer to some inevitable confrontation. But Thomas wasn't about to let them walk into an ambush without a plan. As they neared completion, he called Jean over under the pretense of needing her help with one of the final adjustments. While she held a panel steady for him, he discreetly swapped out one of the fuses with a modified version he'd prepared earlier, a fuse with an intentionally thin wire designed to fail under stress. "What are you doing?" Jean asked quietly when she noticed what he was doing. "Insurance," Thomas replied without looking at her. Jean hesitated but didn't argue. She trusted him enough not to question his judgment, especially now. With the fuse in place and all other repairs completed, they stepped back to inspect their work one last time. The generator hummed steadily now, its lights glowing brighter and more stable than before, a stark contrast to its earlier state of near collapse. "It'll hold," Thomas said confidently as he packed up his tools. "For how long?" Jean asked pointedly. "Long enough," Thomas replied cryptically. They gathered their gear and began making their way back toward the exit, retracing their steps through the labyrinthine corridors of the tower. The drone was still there when they passed it again, still silent, still watching. But this time neither of them spared it more than a passing glance. Their focus was on getting out, back to the mule, back to orbit, back to safety. But even as they moved further away from the generator chamber and closer to their ship, both knew that safety was relative out here in deep space, and that whatever waited for them outside might be even more dangerous than what they'd left behind inside. The comm crackled to life just as Thomas and Jean reached the outer perimeter of the landing zone. The mule was in sight, its weathered hull gleaming faintly under the dim light of Vados-XLR8 swirling skies. Relief was just beginning to settle over them when the voice on the other end of the line shattered it like glass. "This is General Marcus," the gruff voice barked, his tone urgent and clipped. "Do not, repeat, do not enter your ship. You're being targeted. Seek immediate shelter." Thomas froze mid-step, his grip tightening on the toolbox in his hand. Jean's eyes widened in alarm as she turned to him, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean, targeted?" Thomas demanded into his comm, his voice low but tense. "There's an assassin aboard your ship," Marcus replied grimly. "An elite mercenary hired to eliminate you both. We intercepted a transmission confirming their presence. They're waiting for you to board." Jean felt a chill run down her spine. "An assassin? Why us? We're just maintenance workers." "That's irrelevant right now," Marcus snapped. "What matters is staying alive until reinforcements arrive. Get to cover now. We're dispatching a rescue team, but it'll take time." Thomas didn't wait for further instructions. He grabbed Jean's arm and pulled her back toward the shadows of the surrounding structures. "Move," he hissed. The mule loomed ominously in the distance, its silence now feeling less like a refuge and more like a trap. Somewhere inside that ship, someone or something was waiting for them, armed and ready to kill. Jean stumbled as they ran, her mind racing with questions she didn't have time to ask. "Why would anyone hire an assassin for us?" she panted. "Doesn't matter right now," Thomas growled as he scanned their surroundings for potential shelter. His eyes landed on a dilapidated structure nearby, a smaller generator building long since decommissioned, its exterior rusted and overgrown with alien moss. There, he said, pointing toward it. The rhythmic thrum they'd heard earlier seemed louder here, reverberating through the ground beneath their feet as they sprinted toward the building. The air was thick with static electricity, making every hair on their bodies stand on end. The entrance to the old generator building was partially collapsed, but Thomas managed to force open a side hatch with a grunt of effort. He ushered Jean inside before following and sealing the door behind them as best he could. The interior was dark and musty, illuminated only by the faint glow of their suit lights. Rows of ancient machinery lined the walls, their surfaces coated in dust and grime. The place smelled of ozone and decay, a forgotten relic of humanity's early attempts at harnessing planetary energy. Jean leaned against one of the machines, trying to catch her breath. "This can't be happening," she muttered, her voice trembling. "It is," Thomas said bluntly as he began checking their surroundings for anything useful. Tools, materials, anything that could be turned into a weapon or fortification. Jean shook her head in disbelief. "We're just two nobodies fixing broken machines on some backwater planet. Why would anyone go through this much trouble to kill us?" Thomas stopped rummaging and turned to face her, his expression hard but not unkind. "Because we're human," he said simply. Jean frowned, confused. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything," Thomas replied grimly. "You've seen how they look at us, the aliens out there. They hate us because we don't have their fancy powers or advanced biology, but we still manage to survive and thrive in places they wouldn't dare set foot." Jean opened her mouth to respond, but was cut off by a sudden noise outside, a faint metallic clink that sent both of them into high alert. Thomas motioned for silence as he crept toward one of the narrow windows near the ceiling. Peering out cautiously, he saw nothing at first, just the empty expanse of the landing zone beyond. But then he spotted it, a shadow moving with unnatural grace across the terrain, heading straight for the mule. It was humanoid in shape, but moved too fluidly to be entirely organic, likely augmented with cybernetics or advanced tech. "That's our assassin," Thomas muttered under his breath. Jean joined him at the window, her heart pounding as she caught sight of the figure. It was clad in sleek black armor that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making it difficult to track its movements in the dim environment. "What do we do?" she whispered urgently. "We wait," Thomas said firmly. "And we survive." Jean nodded reluctantly, trusting his judgment despite her fear. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they remained hidden inside the generator building, listening intently for any signs of pursuit. The rhythmic thrum of Vados-XLR8's machinery continued unabated, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thomas's calm crackled back to life with Marcus's voice once more. "Hold tight. We're almost there." "How long?" Thomas asked tersely. 10 minutes tops," Marcus replied. "Make it 5, Thomas growled before cutting off the transmission. He turned back to Jean and gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll make it through this." Jean swallowed hard but nodded back. Despite everything, the danger, the fear, there was something comforting about having Thomas by her side. If anyone could get them out of this alive, it was him. Outside, the assassin continued its silent vigil near the mule, seemingly unaware or unconcerned that its targets had slipped away. But Thomas knew better than to underestimate it, or whoever had sent it after them. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The assassin moved with a precision that was almost beautiful in its lethality, its black armor blending seamlessly with the shadows around the mule. It didn't need to rush. It knew its prey had nowhere to go, or so it thought. Inside the old generator building, Thomas and Jean crouched low, their breath shallow as they listened for any sound that might betray the assassin's approach. The rhythmic thrum of the planet's machinery was their only companion, a relentless reminder of the alien world they were stranded on. Thomas checked his wrist scanner again, though he already knew it was useless. The interference from Vados-XLR8's energy fields rendered most of their tech unreliable. Still, he couldn't help but glance at the flickering display, hoping for some sign of the approaching rescue team. "Anything?" Jean whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas shook his head. Nothing yet. Jean bit her lip, her eyes darting toward the sealed hatch they'd entered through. Do you think it knows we're here? Probably, Thomas admitted grimly. But it doesn't know where exactly. That gives us a little time. Jean nodded, though her hands trembled as she gripped her plasma torch tightly. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all she had. Why do you think they sent it after us? I mean, really? We're just repair techs. Thomas leaned back against the wall, his expression hardening. Because we're human, he said again, his voice heavy with conviction. You've seen how they look at us out here, like we're cockroaches scuttling around their pristine galaxy. They hate that we're everywhere now, fixing their machines, building colonies on worlds they abandoned or ignored. Jean frowned but didn't interrupt. They hate that we don't have wings or telekinesis or whatever other tricks they were born with, Thomas continued. But what really gets under their skin is that we don't need any of that crap to survive. We adapt. We endure. And no matter how many times they try to knock us down, we keep getting back up. Jean managed a weak smile despite the fear gnawing at her insides. You make us sound like cockroaches. Thomas chuckled dryly. Maybe we are. But cockroaches don't quit. Their conversation was cut short by a sudden noise outside, a faint metallic scrape that sent both of them into high alert. Thomas motioned for Jean to stay quiet as he crept toward one of the narrow windows near the ceiling. Peering out cautiously, he saw the assassin moving toward their building now, its movements slow and deliberate. It's coming, Thomas muttered under his breath. Jean's grip on her plasma torch tightened as she fought to steady her breathing. What do we do? Thomas thought quickly. They couldn't fight this thing. Not directly. It was too fast, too well-equipped. But maybe, just maybe, they could outthink it. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the ancient machinery lining the walls. Most of it was dead or barely functional, but there were still a few active conduits humming faintly with residual power. Help me with this, Thomas said suddenly, moving toward one of the larger machines. Jean hesitated, but followed him without question. Together, they began stripping wires and rerouting power lines, working as quickly and quietly as possible. What are we doing? Jean asked as she handed him a length of cable. Setting a trap, Thomas replied tersely. The plan was simple. Overload one of the remaining power cells in the generator building and rig it to detonate when triggered remotely. It wouldn't be enough to destroy the assassin outright. Its armor was too advanced for that, but it might buy them enough time for reinforcements to arrive. As they worked, the sounds outside grew louder. The faint hiss of hydraulics and the soft crunch of boots on alien soil drawing closer with each passing second. Hurry, Jean urged nervously. I'm going as fast as I can. Thomas snapped back, sweat dripping down his forehead despite the cool air inside the building. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, their makeshift bomb was ready. Thomas handed Jean a small remote detonator and gave her a firm look. Take this and get to cover, he said. What about you? She asked anxiously. I'll draw it in, Thomas replied grimly. It won't follow both of us if it thinks I'm still here. Jean opened her mouth to protest, but stopped when she saw the determination in his eyes. She nodded reluctantly and slipped away into one of the side corridors while Thomas positioned himself near the center of the room. The hatch creaked open moments later, and Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he caught sight of the assassin stepping inside. Up close, it was even more terrifying, its armor gleaming like liquid shadow and its glowing red visor scanning the room with cold efficiency. Come on, Thomas muttered under his breath as he deliberately knocked over a toolbox to draw its attention. The assassin turned toward him immediately, its movements eerily smooth as it advanced with deadly purpose. Thomas backed away slowly, leading it toward the rig power cell while keeping just out of reach. His pulse raced as he counted down silently in his head. 3 to 1. Now, he shouted into his calm. Jean hit the detonator without hesitation, and the room erupted in a blinding flash of light and sound as the overloaded power cell exploded violently. The shockwave knocked Thomas off his feet and sent debris flying in all directions. When the dust settled, he scrambled to his feet and looked around frantically for any sign of the assassin or Jean. Over here! Jean called out from one of the side corridors, coughing as she emerged from her hiding spot covered in dust but otherwise unharmed. Thomas ran over to her and helped her up just as another voice crackled over their comms. "This is General Marcus. We've got visual on your location. Hang tight. Extraction is inbound." Outside, the roar of engines filled the air as several human dropships descended from orbit like avenging angels. Soldiers poured out onto the ground below, their weapons trained on every shadow as they secured the area around the mule and began sweeping for hostiles. The assassin was gone, either destroyed in the blast or forced to retreat, but Thomas knew this wasn't over yet. Whoever had sent it would try again, and next time they might not be so lucky. But for now, they had survived. As Marcus himself stepped out of one of the dropships and approached them with a grim smile on his face, Thomas allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. "We told you not to quit," Marcus said simply before clapping him on the shoulder. Thomas smirked tiredly and glanced at Jean before replying, "Yeah, well, quitting's not really our style.